Welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that as people hit you with different bits of rhetoric from, one too many hours of Rachel Maddow or perhaps, trolling websites that range from the Huffington Post to the Onion and both almost equally rooted in fact, you have some answers without being mean-spirited. We're not about that here. VirginiaInstitute.org is where you find us online. And if you want to peruse previous episodes of this radio program, go on to our YouTube channel. No video, sorry, ladies. But you can find us at Freedom and Prosperity, full audio versions of our interviews separated so you just listen to the interviews you find interesting. Our first guest, Katharine Gorka, director of the Feulner Institute Center for Civil Society and American Dialogue, penned a great piece on the 1960s riots foreshadowing today's weaponization of black pain, the communist attempt to use race instead of class in this takeover. Katie, thanks for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing?
I'm great. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for writing this because, I pointed out here in our flagship city of Charlottesville, the Miller Center at the University of Virginia has all of Lyndon Johnson's audio recordings first and foremost, for anyone who thinks Richard Nixon was the person who put the tape recorder in the Oval Office. But, some of the most telling stuff is the interactions between Sergeant Shriver and Lyndon Johnson at the development of the, quote, Great Society and the war on poverty and his statements about if we get this bill passed, the beeps will vote for us for 50 years. We're at, I think, 50, almost 55 years now, so I guess he may have had his numbers pretty well crunched there because it seemed to work for about 50 years, and then the wheels started to come off the Great Society.
Well, it's fascinating. I didn't even know that resource existed, and that's so interesting to know. Such interesting things happened under the Johnson administration, not least of which was the report that he commissioned in the wake of all the riots in 67 and 68 called the Kerner Commission Report. And it's really interesting because they concluded that all those riots that cost lives, that cost millions of dollars in damage, were a result of racism. Mm-hmm. But what I found is through the research of this one incredible journalist named Eugene Methvin, who worked for Reader's Digest at the time, which was a great American institution.
Yeah.
He found actually that the riots were a result of something else. He found that while there were absolutely very legitimate grievances among some of the black communities, particularly where they had sort of been forced into very crowded inner cities because of segregation and people not allowing them to buy property outside the city. So there were legitimate grievances, but what Methvin found was that Marxist student groups, particularly the Students for a Democrat Society, run by the infamous Tom Hayden, had actually been laying the groundwork for 3 years in those cities, stoking grievances, building up hatred against the police, against white people, and actually even putting the tools of violence in their hands. So for Johnson to have concluded with the Kerner Commission report that those riots were simply the result of racism was simply just not true.
Well, it fit his narrative because he was trying to develop this Great Society program of handouts and givebacks and softcore plantationism to quell the riots, and that was what he was telling his voters. When really it was even as early as that, making it seemingly worse. That's only 5 or so years after he started really the programs.
Well, and I think it was a real misreading of events. I don't think people realized at the time the degree to which the Marxist students had been laying the groundwork and provoking tensions, sort of much in the same way that we're not recognizing the behind-the-scenes work going on today. And so they really thought, okay, our black population really is this unhappy, and if we don't do something to fix this, we're never going to get our country back under control. But I think it was a wrong reading of events. And at the same time, I think what it really needed was there needed to be ways to address the grievances, but I think the way they did it was not the right way. Much as today, I think there really is room in our country for a conversation about the sort of remnants of racism. And I say that because I've heard too many black people talk about black men. If you're driving a car in the wrong neighborhood, you are going to get stopped, and that shouldn't be going on anymore. So I think that there are very, again, legitimate grievances, but the way that Black Lives Matter wants to solve it is not going to solve anything. And I think, if anything, because of their own racism, they are just further provoking racial tension. They're going to lead us down a very bad path.
Well, if you look at, what a lot of the modern Marxists, the democratic socialist leaders here in Virginia, as well as nationwide, started talking about the fact that because America didn't have such a directly definable class system that Marx required for the development of a communist state, they used race for that. And part and parcel was to create this abject poverty in the black community so that a black man or woman growing up would say, well, yeah, apparently we're the poor class and they're the rich class, and we have to fight them and break them down. And then it starts to make as much sense as Marxism makes.
You are so right, and that's so true, and that's exactly what they recognized. It's really interesting, because the thing that started Eugene Methvin on the path of researching what caused these riots was the fact that in 1960, President Eisenhower was supposed to make a visit to Japan, and the trip had to be canceled because of, quote, communist riots. There were riots going on amongst student groups in Japan, and everybody said these are communist riots. And so his editor said to him, I want you to go find out, how do we know that they're communists? And if you're a communist, how do you start a riot? And that's what led him down this path. And what he found was part of how you start a riot is you stoke the grievances. Mm-hmm. And these kids, the Students for a Democratic Society, were very much about bringing about their Marxist revolution, overturning the world, as they said, the world that they inherited. They did not like the world that they inherited. They wanted to change it. They wanted to overthrow it. They recognized that they couldn't do it on their own, and the way to make it happen was to provoke the grievances of the underclass, particularly the black communities, and to enlist them in their revolutionary project. And that's what they did.
That sounds so eerily familiar to what we're hearing now. But even beyond that, it sounds very eerily familiar to what we heard in the 18th century in France, long before Karl Marx was ever born. The idea of using poverty to, create a street army of grievance to win power, and it wound up with almost 25 years of bloodshed in France, civil war, ending up with a brutal dictator, military dictator taking over just to create peace out of the chaos. Is it cyclical, Katie, that we're almost doomed to keep repeating this as poverty, and people start saying, well, I don't have anything, and they have more than I think I should have, and then somebody says, yeah, and we're all going to march and get it. Come on with us and grab a pitchfork. Are we doomed to continue to do this time and time again, or can we... Yeah, I think the United States may have inoculated itself for a couple of hundred years, but I don't know if we can continue.
I'm so glad that you actually raised the point of the French Revolution, because I think it is super, super important. Look, there's the American Revolution and the French Revolution are at polar opposite ends of how you deal with change and how you deal with parts of your population that are disgruntled, right? In the French Revolution, much as Black Lives Matter is saying today, what they said was, out with the old, in with the new, right? we're not going to work our differences out amongst ourselves using the rule of law and a deliberative, thoughtful process. We're simply going to kill everybody we didn't like, and we're going to create a new society. And they really did. They created, a new calendar, new everything, right? Got rid of religion, turned the churches into meeting halls, killed the priests, everything. And that's, honestly, that's what you're seeing today, not just with Black Lives Matter, but the 1619 Project. The authors of that project, are basically, they are not asking for better relationship between black and white. They're asking for a reversal. They want to see whites subjugated and blacks elevated. And it's going to, if it were allowed to run its course, it's going to run the same course as the French Revolution. You're going to see people dead on the streets. I have no doubt. Whereas what the American founders did, and this is the incredible thing about our country, right? Mm-hmm. They looked back at hundreds of years, thousands of years of history, and they figured out what is the best way. It was an experiment, right? They said, let's look at history, what worked, what didn't work, and let's try to come up with a system that we think can do away with that kind of violence and violent overthrow every time a new group wants to come to power. And the system they created has been brilliant. Mm-hmm. I think you raise an important question, though, is, has it run its course? Is this as long as it could last? I don't think so. I think that Americans, even though we've done a terrible job of teaching history and teaching civics in recent years, I still think Americans have a strong enough taste for liberty and justice and the rule of law that they are not going to abandon that system. And what to me is the real proof of that is the sharp decline in support for Black Lives Matter over the last few months, right? In the beginning, I think a lot of people supported that notion, Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. We really wanted to get on board that. But when people started to see the reality of what this organization is about, when they saw the proclamations they want to do away with the nuclear family, when they came out so openly talking about their Marxist background, support has started to sharply decline. And not to mention the violence and the protests. Americans recognize this is not how we solve problems in our country.
Katharine Gorka, director of the Feulner Institute Center for Civil Society and the American Dialogue at the Heritage Foundation. And thank you so much for taking time out with us. I want to circle to a little of what you were saying there. I mean, I was, for a long time, connected with and friendly with the now very famous or infamous Hawk Newsom, who actually saved me from a savage beating I so richly deserved during the riots of 2017 here in Charlottesville, because he knew me, and he knew me not to be a racist, which this young man was sure, based on the color of the skin I was, irony used for later. But Hawk Newsom came to my defense because he knew me not to be a racist. And his rhetoric, he spoke at pro-Trump rallies. And now you listen to him talking about burning the system down completely. And you realize that somebody has created a narrative, and if he's going to remain president of Black Lives Matter in New York, which I'm sure is a lucrative position, he has to toe a line that he wasn't towing up until 2 years ago, Katie. And that's where I think a lot of people have started to say, hold it, this is a political movement, not a movement of, hey, the police shouldn't kill somebody who they have in custody.
Right. And I mean, I think a couple things happened. I think a lot of people didn't like the fact that when you clicked on donate here for Black Lives Matter, it took you to a Democratic Party fundraising
Act Blue, site. Right? Act Blue is it?
Yes, Act Blue, that's it. And the other thing that I find really interesting is the fact that just in the last few days, in fact, Black Lives Matter has taken down some of its more egregious content, sort of cleaning out some of the Marxist stuff. So they're I think that they themselves see the decline in support, but I really hope enough people have woken up to the reality of what this organization is about, that they stop supporting it and that they find more constructive ways to support the blacks in our country, right? And to lead to more constructive conversations about how to deal with the last vestiges of racism that exist.
A lot of the black community leaders I speak to here on the street level, the real grassroots leaders, say, hold on a second, we don't want to get rid of the police. The police are the only ones really defending us. We want to get rid of some of the policies that say, hey, stop that kid if you don't know where he's going and frisk him down, that kind of thing, and no-knock warrants. I'd love to see civil asset forfeiture go away in Virginia, some of the things that have developed. But these were all things that were legislated, Kathy, and it's bothersome to me that through this whole bit, the legislators or those who came later from them are feigning no knowledge of the laws that the police officers are actually out there, supporting, and enforcing. Why aren't we holding? And maybe it's the brilliance of the way this was all put together by the Marxists. The legislators, not the police officers, who are only just carrying out the laws and the policies as put forth by these people.
Yeah, I would love to live in that world, right?
Right? Hey, it's not my job.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I think you're absolutely right, and I've heard the exact same thing. Black people do not want to see the police go away. And the other, I think, really interesting and important lesson from the riots of the 60s, something that economists and sociologists discovered, decades later, is that the people who were hurt the most by those riots, which were supportedly for racial justice, were the blacks themselves. Black property owners and property values were impacted for up to 3 decades in cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Wilmington, Newark. And not just property prices, but black employment and black wages were also hurt for as much as 3 decades following those riots. So you really have to ask yourself, is rioting the way to fix the problem that we're facing today?
Well, and I've made the case that as in the 60s, even today, a lot of it seeds in the way the French Revolution did. They find people who have been in abject poverty, perhaps multi-generational poverty, and at some point you start to say, gosh, I just don't see any way out of it. And a lot of it is so easily addressed economically, but yet we almost created a sclerotic economy around not just cronyism, but labor laws, and we've driven out jobs in the community, and something that the president had been winning so much great support for in the black and in the Latino communities for bringing jobs back and creating landscapes where a young person of color in the inner city could say, hey, I got a job that's now paying my bills, and I'm earning and saving money, and I'm getting, improving my neighborhood. That's really the secret sauce, isn't it?
100%. I mean, I think there's a couple things that are just absolutely critical to fixing this problem. One is welfare. Welfare has done more to hurt the black community than I think any other policy, because it hurt the family, and the family we know is essential to ending poverty, and as well as bringing down rates of crime. But the other thing that welfare does, and I think people don't sufficiently think about this, welfare impacts labor mobility. So, the U.S. economy is constantly evolving and changing. And what happens is, as one industry dies out in one place, something else will emerge in another place. And sometimes this is painful, right? You have to leave one place because there simply are no jobs, and you have to go another place. And the problem is, welfare locks people in place. It doesn't allow for that free movement, or let's say it hinders that free movement of people. So, this is it's one of those perfect examples of, government policies that may have been well-intended, in the long run have really the opposite effect.
Well, and I think that's where we are, and if anything, perhaps the real impact, and something you're sensing in your column, Katie, is that we may have just bought some time instead of addressing the issues as we saw them manifest in the 60s, because I really think we are better. I really think as humans we are better to each other, but we've created these societies where, a government program of entitlement. We see the the kid that shot the church in Charleston. His father, apparently, according to the reports that the South Carolina reporters I've read, the dad was what in the 50s or 60s would be called a bum, were living on welfare, and complained to his kids incessantly that he couldn't get work because of quotas rather than perhaps his alcoholism. But his kids were raised believing that they were poor because black people had quotas over them. And so here are all these quote unquote, as you say, well-intentioned policies that have just continued to, if not foment, at least not allow to heal those scars of the Jim Crow era.
Yeah, but at the same time, I'm kind of, in spite of all the terrible things going on, and it has been terrible. It's been a terrible summer for our country. But in spite of that, I have to say, I do see real signs that give me hope, and I think one of them is some of the incredible voices from the black community that have emerged, and not to say they weren't there, but maybe we weren't listening so closely. We weren't giving them as much of a platform, or they weren't getting the platform. There are incredible voices that have emerged. I mean, one of my favorites is Bob Woodson. He's an older pastor. He's been at this work for decades, but he's really kind of, I think, exploded into the mainstream because he came out with that great initiative, 1776 Unites, in response to the New York Times 1619 Project.
Right.
And he brought together just a super group of both black and white, but predominantly black voices, scholars mostly, who've come out and said they don't support this narrative of victimhood. I think about Carol Swain, this incredible woman who became a professor at both Princeton and Vanderbilt, who says, if she had been given that narrative as a teenage mother, and I think she became a mother at the age of 15, she never would have gone on to live the life that she did, getting a PhD and becoming a leading academic voice. So, to me, that's a sign of hope, and I hope that these are the voices that will prevail, and I hope that this is the kind of conversation that will prevail in this country, where it's a conversation of love between black and white, and not the anger and the racism and the bigotry of groups like Black Lives Matter.
Well, and the bigotry and the understanding that we are all, exactly the same, and it's one of the messages that seemed to be coming out of the 60s and then got derailed, as you said, in those riots. What about, and something to hang our hat on, Katie, and I appreciate your time this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. I want to throw this at you, and we're not a political program. We're a 501c3. I'm not trying to advocate for a candidate. But we watched the president go in, much to, I'm sure, the chagrin of his political consultants, into Detroit and met with the ministers there and said, how has this been working for you? And he continues to outreach, as it has been frustrating for many years to ask conservative, free market believing candidates to address the inner cities, only to have their consultants say, no, we can't afford the time there. We need to focus on, quote, bringing out the base in the more suburban areas. And yet the president has had, even remarkable, but certainly not ubiquitous success doing that. Can we empower some more of that? Is that a thing to hang our hat on, that maybe what the president has done by reaching into these communities will convince conservative free marketers that it's not a lost cause to go into an inner city like Baltimore and say, how's this been working for you?
Yeah, I think 100%, and I think you're seeing it happen. I mean, I do think the president has done a tremendous job. I mean, he's been one of the great forces helping to elevate some of these black voices, bringing them into some of the different councils or different initiatives or onto his staff, as well as reaching out into those communities and going into those communities. And I think you touched on the fact that he met with pastors. I mean, this is something else that I think we don't sufficiently acknowledge the incredible value of particularly the church-based groups that are providing services and support in these inner cities. Because honestly, in some instances, it's only through an act of charity that it's even viable. But I think it also is testimony to the fact that what is healing really going to take? What is change really going to take? And I think about, there's one group in particular that I really admired that's in Georgia. It's called the Georgia Center for Opportunity. I'm blanking on the name. Something like the Georgia Center for Work and Opportunity, something like that. So they started out as a traditional NGO who wanted to go in and do good and thought changing policies is the way to go. And what they eventually realized was changing policies alone is not going to change lives. You have to go in and you have to work with people in a loving way to help heal some of what's gone wrong. And whether it's the old vestiges of Jim Crow, whether it's, people coming out of prison, whether it's, black men who've grown up without fathers, how do you help them to heal in a way that they themselves can become good and loving fathers? This is heart work. This is not the work of government. This is the work of people to people, going into these types of activities in a spirit of love, and I think that's what we need more of in this country.
Well, while you were telling me about it, I think I found them, Georgia Center for Opportunity. If it's the website I'm looking at, it is exactly that point where God has endowed us all with gifts and talents, and realizing them and actualizing them is what we're all supposed to be about, Katie. And they do look like the right idea. And thank you so much for chronicling it in your piece and the work there at the Feulner Center, Feulner Institute, and best to you. And thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
Coming up next, Michelle Minton, we're going to talk about the government's dietary guidelines, especially as it comes to alcohol consumption. Yes, well, I'm sorry, we got holiday weekends approach, I'm sure, but we'll talk about that with Michelle Minton next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.